how should warning systems be done, or how should warnings be sent? What should be the time frame? If a disaster is about to happen, let's say in another 1 month, what should be the arrangement towards having early warning systems in place that even alerts the agencies in charge of managing disaster so that they're able to warn people ahead of time?
All right, thank you very much indeed, Blessing. I think when you talk about disaster preparedness, what you need to do is called scenario planning. Some of those scenarios planning are to be done, particularly trying to stimulate all the possible man-made disaster and those natural disasters that may occur. So you put early warning systems in place that try to see how you can mitigate those risks when they do occur. So the early warning systems are stimulated to see whether it's coming from climate change, whether it's fire, other kinds of disaster that may occur. So when you put those kind of systems in place, you are able to plan ahead and able to stimulate the occurrences of those risks. Then you are able to anticipate and able to respond when the risk do occur. So that's what early warning system is all about.
Let's look at the approach or the level of response to early warning system here in Nigeria. A typical example is when flooding is being announced or is imminent. What do you think, from your observation, has been the level of response or the attitude or the approach to early warning system in Nigeria?
I think there's a challenge in terms of disaster risk management in totality. In other climes, even beyond the emergency response department of states and the federal government, you have institutes that deals with disaster risk that help those agencies to be able to plan and find a way to respond in a critical manner to issues even before they occur. But then, in terms of response in recent time, particularly flooding, the formation is always out there. But then, at the end of the day, that do still occur, and the damage is still done. So, I think we should find a way to see how we can stop the flooding even before they occur. So, we need to re-engineer the processes of how we plan for disaster. More risk assessment should be done to mitigate those crises, particularly flooding, which is as a result of climate change, and sometimes the release of water dam that has impact on the people.
All right, but let's look again at the warning systems that we have in Nigeria, taking the case of flood again as a case in study. When flood is about to happen, maybe the earliest we get sometimes is 2 weeks, or maybe at the beginning of the year, we have 9 months warning of heavy rainfalls. But really, it doesn't give a prediction as to the exact time sometimes. And even when it does, there are warnings this could happen. People are just told to evacuate, but there are no action, follow-up action tied to the warning. It's just like sounding a bell, move out. But you're not telling people where to move to.
I think more often than not, when you talked about search and rescue, which is an aspect of disaster management, once you put a warning system in place, there's a need to evacuate people. And I do know that most of the time when government do that kind of things, they make arrangement in particular places where people can go to. But because of our cultural tie to the environment that we belong, sometimes people don't even respond to such alternative that has been provided for them by government. So I think that's issue. So the National Emergency Management Agency and that of the state must provide adequate education to inform the people once there's any warning systems and there's a need to evacuate people. People should be evacuated to the designated places where their life can be secured.
Look at the agencies who are in position to manage this crisis. The National Emergency Agency at the federal level, you have a replica of that at state level. Now, how much of, when it comes to looking at the capacity? Are they well equipped for this task? And then what kind of training would you expect to ensure that they do their job diligently?
I think they have the requisite skill set and the requisite training, but I think the challenge is the collaborative effort between the Emergency Management Agency itself and other departments of government that are responsible for other services, particularly if you talk about fire service, then you equally have the emergency at the local government level, but there's a challenge at the local government level. To what extent can they respond as even the first responder at the local government level? So I think at the local level, local government level, we need to make an improvement in terms of how they respond to emergency. But at the state level, particularly Lagos State, they have the basic equipment and their response in terms of emergency is up to speed based on global best practices.
When we talk about disaster, sometimes it can be natural, sometimes it may not be natural occurring. But are there certain things that need to be done to enhance the ability of NEMA to be able to foresee or predict ahead of time? So in a lot of cases, disasters are about to happen. How do we upscale that to ensure that apart from flooding, in all other areas, they are ahead of time before it even happens?
Yeah, I think they have those statistics they can anticipate. And in terms of disaster risk planning and preparedness, there are basic flows that must occur to anticipate this. I think the challenge for me here is to what extent even citizens are aware of possible disasters. So, like the Lagos State government in particular has a safety commission that has improved on the ecosystem of how you can tackle disasters. So even if you are building a gas station, you need to get a license from the safety commission. Every due diligence is done in terms of risk assessment. Even the contiguous areas are insured. There's a compulsory insurance currently being done by the Safety Commission in Lagos that address this critical issue. So by extension, other states should emulate the Lagos State government in terms of how they can put a regulatory framework to mitigate disaster generally, whether they are natural or they are man-made.
Let's look at this impression here, this religious bias when it comes to issues of disaster. People just, put religion into it and have this mindset and nothing can happen to me. And as a result of that, the natural things to be done to mitigate this kind of effect of this kind of thing, people don't take it with all sense of seriousness. How do we begin to change the narrative or correct this mindset for people to own or have sense of responsibility when it comes to disaster management, for them to understand that there are things they need to do to ensure that this thing doesn't happen or take place?
The National Emergency Agency, with their state counterparts, and particularly in Lagos, I like to use the Lagos example. They have a safety commission that has upscaled the way businesses operate by putting all the framework in place that can forestall any disaster. So this cultural mindset, there must be education where people know that disaster can occur, and when they occur, they can be very devastating. So that cultural nuance that let's leave it for God, the cliché that normally take place in our environment. The insurance community must provide a way to educate the public on the importance of insurance in terms of safety. I think with that collaborative effort between state emergencies and federal government and local government and some agencies that are working in the area of disaster management, we have to foster that.
Let's look at what should be the role of citizens when it comes to ensuring that early warnings are being adhered to, and then when it comes to disaster management, ideally, what should be the role of citizens and how can they complement the effort of rescue team to ensure that this issue of managing disaster is properly achieved?
Okay, within the disaster management cycle, when you look at the areas of preparedness, there's an interface between citizens, particularly from the point of view of advocacy. So maybe the question should address more how adequate education should be provided to the citizen on one hand. On the other hand, citizen being the gatekeeper in terms of how to protect their environment. So the feedback into that preparedness cycle with information that will enable the management agency to be able to respond appropriately when disasters do occur.
So let's talk about challenges. What challenges do you think Nigeria has encountered in trying to ensure early warning systems, given the operations of the agency NEMA? What challenges do you think that they have been faced with in trying to warn people early of disaster?
I think the first one is funding. It's very essential. I don't think they really have adequate funding in terms of how they can articulate all the early warning systems. And I talked about scenario planning, which is a very critical element of disaster management, where you can stimulate all possible man-made and natural disaster. There's an institute in the UK called the Humanitarian Future that is responsible globally to stimulate all kinds of natural disaster in a way that they feed those information to national government. So in that regard, more funding should be made available to those agencies. Two, they need to provide adequate education to citizens in terms of what constitutes disaster risk, in terms of how to respond, in terms of how to mitigate those risks. With those elements in place, then those challenges will be dealt with tangentially.
Now let's look at the issue of flooding, which is very peculiar to our environment here. You had the early warnings coming from Cameroon about the release of water from the dam, and then the natural occurrence from our own environment here. How much of proactiveness have you seen when it comes to heeding to early warnings and preparation? Let's look specifically when it comes to the issue of flooding now.
I think it's unfortunate that over the years we have had issues of flooding, particularly from the water released from the dam in Cameroon, and there were supposed to be buffer dams that were supposed to receive those water. So therefore, those in government should find a way to resolve this issue proactively, because if a problem is already been identified, to what extent can we find a solution to fix that? That will drastically reduce the flooding. Then we need to find a way to clear the various inland waterways that could be a risk equally when those dams are released. So once we're able to put those kind of mitigation in place, then we can deal with the issues of flooding.
So what is the role of local communities in early warning process, and how can their insights and local knowledge be incorporated into the warning and response process as well?
I do know that there are civil society organizations and community-based organizations that work within that ecosystem. More often than not, they do what we call advocacy to stimulate interest in terms of how you can protect the environment. And I think the emergency response agency from local government to state to the federal normally have interface in a way that the community can provide information in terms of preparedness, in terms of response. On the other hand, I think the National Emergency Agency equally do education to inform community of possible danger within those environments. So within the disaster cycle framework, some of these issues are dealt with. To what extent impacts on the community is a different discussion entirely.
Let's look at local emergency management agencies. In most local government, they seem not to be in existence, because Blessing was talking about how to localize this thing so that at least you get better effort. What should be done to ensure that proper mobilization is done, training, and when it comes to equipping local rescue team or emergency agencies What should be done in that light to ensure that they complement? At the federal level, you have budgets for the states, they are doing their best. But when it comes to the local level, that's where the gap is. What should be done to fill this gap and ensure there's proper synergy between the local rescue team, they are properly utilized and equipped for the task ahead of them?
Essentially, there's a problem when you talk about the territorial dimension of the state, which is essentially federalism. There's been a clamor that there should be a true federalism. The local government have a challenge generally in terms of how the state relate with their funding. So the architecture must be reversed in a way that local government become more autonomous in terms of the way they do their things. In terms of emergency preparedness, I think there's no adequate funding and they are not really fully represented. The name just Local Government Emergency Management Agency. Even when you ask them to do some level of learning and development to aggregate some of the possible crises that will come to those places, they always complain about funding. So government, that value chain must be recalibrated in a way that communities become the first owner or first responder when the crises do occur.
We've been talking about early warning systems in terms of disaster preparedness, but are there certain activities that predisposes a community or a place to more occurrence of disaster?
Yeah, they are. So if you are living in a coastal community, then the scenarios are different. You deal with issues of flooding. If you are living in an arid area that is prone to fire and all that, there are preparedness that are put in place. So different risk is already identified during preparedness. Then issues of those specific risks are addressed by the various agencies. But to what extent do the community imbibe those early warning systems is the challenge in terms of how you manage disaster risk.
What impact do you think an agency like National Orientation Agency make when it comes to people heeding to early warnings? You know, this is the agency saddled with the responsibility of creating public awareness. Of what impact will that be when they take that initiative of giving people warnings earlier with respect to imminent crisis or disaster?
I think the focus at the federal level should be on trying to see how we can strengthen the early warning system mechanism in the disaster risk management cycle. But this is okay in the sense that rather than responding to emergencies, it's better to find a way proactively to address those emergencies so that they don't even occur. But I think more often than not, they are more interested in distributing relief materials where some of their interests are well taken up. So, but I think proactive measurement based on those scenario planning that we talked about earlier should be able to help those agencies to adequately forestall even when they have anticipated preparedness to tackle those risks.
So how does infrastructure impact the ability to address emergencies?
I think technology and artificial intelligence has come to stay. So the agency should deploy drones, deploy technology in terms of the scenario planning that I mentioned earlier, how they can anticipate the weather. People are there already who do the weather forecasting, so they can universally look at all those issues and find a way to address them using technology and artificial intelligence to resolve those issues.
Okay, I'm looking at a situation where there's been a disaster in a community and the access road linking that community is in a deplorable condition. So what happens? How can relief efforts get to them?
Technology can be deployed. Drones can be used to deliver medicines and other food items without necessarily using the road, and they will be delivered appropriately with the aid of technology. But then we need to improve on the infrastructure so that response become easy, particularly from the point of view of first responder.
Are there roles expected of stakeholders like religious leaders, community leaders, parents, when it comes to strengthening early warning system in Nigeria?
And that's the education that we spoke about earlier. And I said there are interface between the management agencies. So sometimes they go to schools to educate them in terms of disaster, fire, water, flooding. So those communications are there. But I think they need to scale up that communication interface so that we can improve on the engagement within the communities, the families and religious leaders.
Now, according to the National Disaster Response Plan, NDRP, it says that it actually establishes a process and structure for the systemic, coordinated and effective delivery of federal assistance to address consequences of any major disaster emergency. Now, looking at the way disasters are tended to, whether in terms of early warning or warning, because sometimes there is no early warning, it's just a warning, and even a response. Does it seem like it's working in tandem with the National Disaster Response Plan? Are we having that systemic, coordinated, and effective delivery? And if we're not, what is the missing link?
I think there's a high level of collaboration between the federal and the state. They share information from time to time. They give information to states up to the local government. That kind of ecosystem do exist where they share information. And like I said, if you look at the entire disaster management cycle, you talked about preparedness, you talked about mitigation, you talked about response. So each of these layers, they are collaboration between state and the federal government to address those issues. But where the bulk of the job is emergency preparedness, where you anticipate all possible disaster that can occur based on climate change, based on the weather focus, and you're able to meaningfully respond. But do they have the adequate fund and technology to drive that process? That again is a different conversation.
What do you think is largely responsible for a development where, in spite of early warnings, people still fall victim? For instance, the issue of flooding. The warnings are issued earlier, and you still discover that people, maybe they were told to evacuate the area, yet that's not been done. What do you think is largely responsible? In spite of the early warnings, people still fall victim, and then in the end, people will start blaming the government and all that.
Yeah, I think it's the cultural attachment to people's abode, where people live. People are so culturally attached to their environment. So when you even do those early warning systems, and you're able to speak to people that they should vacate those environment, and that cultural imperative normally determine their decision-making process, that we are here and this is our land and God will continue to protect them. But I think the government has a responsibility to find a way, once that warning system has been put in place, then they should evacuate people appropriately so that they don't suffer those crises.
Okay, so for yearly kinds of emergency that it's already known that maybe at this time of the year such emergency would arise, these are quite common with issues of flooding. What kind of facilities should we have to enable the agency or to enable government attend to it when it does happen? Femi talked about some persons refusing or not being willing to relocate even when warning signs are given. But some of the reason that they give is that there is no place to move to. Sometimes they are made to move to schools or makeshift arrangement that looks uninhabitable. So what can be done in that regard?
It's an interim arrangement. It's just to forestall a disaster. So when that kind of communication come in place, people should willfully leave those disaster zone to what you may call safe haven, pending when that disaster is dealt with. So the appeal is that people should respond when early warning systems are given to them in respect of a particular disaster that may occur in those environments. Two, citizens must equally live responsibly in terms of keeping their environment clean, particularly when it comes to flooding. They need to clear the inland waterways so that even when the flood comes, they'll be able to get into their normal channels into the ocean.
In other places like storm houses where people go into, maybe when there's a hurricane or something like that. Now, this kind of incidents we're referring to, like the yearly floodings, are almost an annual occurrence. So making a temporary arrangement that looks uninhabitable and even looks like it makes people susceptible to disease and infections, isn't that something that should be corrected with more standard structures, even though people are going to live there temporarily, to make it easy for people to move when it's come?
Yeah, in terms of response mechanism, you have various way provisions are made. The UN Habitat had some designs of makeshift houses that are temporary, that are relatively better than putting people in schools and church and mosque and all that. So again, once that preparedness is adequately planned for, then international agencies that work within that ecosystem are able to assist. And I know that the UN Habitat, the UN Humanitarian Affairs have some makeshift design houses that they use to provide some kind of little safe haven for people when disasters do occur in their communities.
What are the critical things that form a proper rescue operations? And then what should be the ideal when it comes to rescue operations compared to what is obtainable here in this climate?
All right, within that disaster risk management framework that we spoke about earlier, within the framework of preparedness, you have an aspect in preparedness that deal with essentially about medics, about first responder. These are people that are properly trained in terms of how they will rescue people when there's crisis. But the challenge here is that when there's a disaster risk, rather than people leaving the site, people are crowding the site in our environment. That becomes a major challenge for responders to be able to respond to those crises. But then again, a high level of education is still needed from the emergency agencies in terms of how people should be educated that once they've reported a disaster, then they should move away from those environments so that first responder, particularly medics, are able to move in quickly and find a way to rescue people from the risk or the disaster sites to safety.
In conducting search and rescue, even those who are rescuing people still have their safety to be bothered about. So how is it done that the rescue team also is safe?
They are trained in terms of general safety mechanisms because you have to protect yourself before you can even protect other people. So those training in terms of fire drills, in terms of emergency response, those training are given periodically. So when they move into a site, they equally have technology that aids their work in, and you even have sniffing dogs that can help you identify human beings. So those training are there. So, but I think our ecosystem needs to be improved upon so that we have a high level of how we respond, particularly where people even go to risk sites when rather than find a way to rescue people, people are willing to just lament. I think that's what we need to find a way to resolve in our community. So they have the adequate training. Then in addition to rescue, there's another element that we call psychosocial support services that have to do with issue of trauma, counseling, so that people don't get so impacted negatively with the impact of that disaster. So you have various layers of response until you get people into a safety environment.
Okay, you were almost answering my question, but let's look at the three phases of rescue operation. You have the phase, you have the rescue operation itself, then the post, which comes after. Now let's look at the the preparation level, which is the first thing. What level of preparation should be put in place to ensure that first responders, the level of response is swift, so rapid that you don't have delay? But in this climb, you always have this report of there's no this, you don't have that. If it's fire, you hear reports that, okay, water is not available, vehicle is not available, there's no few things like that. So the pre-phase, which is the preparation towards the rescue operations, what is the idea of what should be properly done?
In the preparedness planning scenario, every element has been stimulated through what you call gaming and all that. So at that level, every levels of possible risk has been identified. So that preparedness, whoever is responsible for each of those levels of preparedness have been adequately prepared ahead of time. So same preparation will now be upscaled in terms of the response itself where you're in the field. Then after the response, then you talk about the medics, you talk about the humanitarian assistant that will come, how you get into the hospitals, dispensaries and all other places. So those framework are already there in the emergency preparedness plan. There's a framework, a national framework, there's a state framework, there's a local government framework. I think the major challenge we have is at the local government. Then that means we need to recalibrate the process from the local government in terms of training, in terms of providing equipment. Then public infrastructure that support responses must be improved, like water hydrants in the public space so that you can easily get water if it has to do with fire. Then people should know how to clear the way for responder to move quickly. But here, you have people trying to move into a field and people are still struggling to block them. But in some other climates, you hear that ambulance making a noise, people just move in one direction, people move to respond to those crises.
Now, for search and rescue to happen, what kind of coordinated approach or coordinated system do we need to have between agencies? I'm talking about interagency operations now.
I think there are various levels. At the federal, you have the Director General relating with the State Director General. Then you have emergency coordinator in each of those states that respond to this issue. So you have lines of charges from federal to local government. So there are people that are saddled with the responsibility. You call them emergency response coordinator. So they are the ones that deals with the first responder in the first instance when there's a disaster.
Are there agencies that will need to work with NEMA, for instance, when a disaster happens to ensure effective search and rescue?
Oh yes, that collaboration is the Ministry of Health, the Fire Service. There's one other service at the state level that have a collaboration, an existing platform. So they have a meeting from time to time where they review things. So you have that. Like in Lagos, you have a NEMA state coordinator that works with the Lagos State Emergency. Then you have at the local government. So there's a synergy that already occur among those agencies. How those synergies should work better, then government need to put more investment in that sector so that they can respond appropriately.
How do you handle the interference from civilians or people who are not trained who come into the scene? There's an emergency out of emotions or concern. They come into the scene and they seem to be impeding the work of those who are trained to do that, and therefore it becomes difficult for the trained personnel to carry out their work. How do we stop this trend or handle this kind of trend?
Is to train people ahead of time. In other climb, like the National Youth Service Corps that we mentioned in one of these programs recently, people need to be trained as first responder in case of disaster. Therefore, those who don't have business being in the risk area don't need to be there. So education is very critical in terms of how you pass information to the citizen. But there are other service agencies that work in line with NEMA. You have St. John Ambulance, you have the Red Crescent, Red Cross. These are people that deals with emergencies. So they work with the state emergency system to provide succor when disasters do occur.
All right, let's talk about accountability and documentation during search and rescue operations. And how important is it to track the progress or track situations as they happen?
With the aid of technology, I think you have a Google Map that can address some of those issues. But in terms of the actual count, I think we're very poor in terms of data management. People can't even account for their household. So we need to put a mechanism in place. Like in Lagos, for example, all the streets are well numbered. That, to a very large extent, will help for rescue. Then technology, in terms of artificial intelligence, in terms of drone, those can help as well. But then we need to account for people. Therefore, record keeping or data management is equally crucial at the family level, so that when crises do occur, people are able to get a register. And that's why you go to some premises, you are requested to put your name and details down, but people sometimes don't want to do that. Those are very important. If there's a crisis, you're able to account for people that are in those data, and that can help to quickly resolve those issues.
When it comes to rescue operations, the victims are usually the priority, but it's not just limited to that. You have to secure the area or the non-human elements that are there if vehicles are involved and things like that. But what you're often seeing is the areas are not being secured in case where you have a bomb blast and then another one could reoccur because people come there to rescue and all that. How do we ensure that proper holistic approach is used when it comes to rescue operations, not just the victim, the environment is secured, and also the non-human elements are also secured?
I think it's a systemic issue. We need to address that as a people or as a country, that disaster risk management is a very serious business, and lives are involved in this matter. So people that are not involved in trying to provide rescue when disaster happen have no business being in those environments. Then those personnel that have been trained must equally respond proactively in line with their call of duty. Places should be condoned of, and they should be labeled appropriately that these are risk zones. That's what you do elsewhere. You mark the place off and put all the necessary signage that this is a risk zone and that you don't have any business being there. So those are the practices that we need to have so that we're able to control.
All right, as we wrap this up, for those who are involved in search and rescue, the personnel of the disaster management agencies, now this is a very risky job. Are there certain incentives that can be put in place to encourage them and even bring in others?
The incentives, that's what we call workmen compensation. They are adequately insured because of the nature of their job. That is a given in disaster risk management. They are well insured for their job.
Let's talk about training now for the personnel who are first responder or who are in position to rescue victims. How often should this training take place, and what kind of training will you recommend they should have in terms of safety or whatever it is? What are the kind of training you think they should have, and how often should this take place?
There's a stipulated training between the Red Cross and the emergency agencies globally. So those trainings are continuous training in terms of how you administer first aid and you rescue people. On a periodic basis, there's a training and there's a retraining for those people that are involved in disaster risk management. The training is on a continuous basis, and then you have all kinds of people providing. Even non-governmental organizations that work within those ecosystems equally provide training for first responders in particular.